Hello and welcome to this Trigger 2-minute tutorial, and today I'm going to be describing how to configure Trigger to work with an external controller, and that's the DJ TechTools MIDI Fighter 3D. So I have a MIDI Fighter connected to a USB port on my computer here now, and I've got a blank Trigger project in front of me. And the first thing we do is we go to Project Options and we select the MIDI Devices tab. And if Trigger is not seeing the MIDI Fighter, then simply click on Search for Hardware, and that forces Trigger to go off and look for MIDI devices that are attached to the computer. We'll select the MIDI Fighter for both MIDI input and output, and then we'll click on Reset. Then we'll go to the cue sheet layout page, and I want my cue sheet to reflect the grid layout of the buttons on the MIDI Fighter. So that's a 4x4 grid. So we'll set it to 4 rows by 4 columns. Then we'll go to the MIDI options page and we'll select external controller and MIDI Fighter 3D from the list there. Now you can see I can choose to invert the orientation of the MIDI Fighter, but mine is sitting on the desktop this way round, so we'll keep it as the default. And as long as we've got a 4x4 grid in our cue sheet, then we have the option to map MIDI Fighter notes to the cue buttons. So we'll select that, and now the MIDI notes will be mapped automatically as I add cues to my project. The other options I'll keep the same. I could choose to activate side button control, which would allow me to add more functionality to the side buttons on the MIDI Fighter. And that would be configured in a similar way to the round button control on the Novation Launchpad, but we're going to leave that for today. I'll click Done to that, and you'll see the changes are reflected in my project. And now I'll add some samples to my project, like that. And on my MIDI Fighter, the rings around the buttons are now lit up in blue to represent the cue buttons in my project. And if I were to drag these buttons around, then those changes, well, I'm asked if I want to remap automatically, so I'll click yes to that, and the changes are reflected on the MIDI Fighter. If I were to change the color of a button, likewise, the change is reflected in the ring on my around that appropriate button on the MIDI Fighter. And finally, if I was to add a second cue sheet, and now I can switch between cue sheets using the rectangular buttons on the MIDI Fighter. So that option can be controlled as well. And the appropriate cue sheet again gets mapped to the MIDI Fighter buttons. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed today's tutorial, and you'll join me next time.